47 minutes. That's how long Emily sat with the napkin folded tightly between her fingers, waiting for the man who had promised a future to the table across from her, watching the chair opposite remain empty until the only thing that answered the silence was the soft buzz of her phone. The restaurant around her with a scatter of murmured conversations and clinking glass. Overhead, a chandelier breathed light down like a warm, indifferent halo. Her blue dress, her favorite, caught the glow and held it, the fabric a quiet promise she had let herself believe in for weeks. She had imagined this night a dozen different ways. Not once had she pictured the cold, clipped 3 words that blinked across the screen. "Sorry, Em, I can't." No explanation. No apology that could be measured for sincerity. The text felt like a slap dressed in pixels, a small, efficient cruelty. Around her, the world refused to be private. A waiter slid past with a tray of oysters, a couple at the next table leaned closer and murmured. Time, which had felt elastic in the days leading up to this moment, contracted suddenly, sharp and brittle. Emily folded the napkin again and set it down slowly. That small motion, careful, civilian, was the anchor she clung to. She was a teacher. She knew how to calibrate her face to sympathy and warmth. She could perform composure as well as she could recommend a poem. But beneath the public calm was a churn of betrayals. 3 years of soft half-promises, afternoons spent in the hazy comfort of a man who took and took until she stopped asking for more. Tonight had been supposed to be the point. Tonight was supposed to be the future. She rose automatically, because staying felt like counting down. Her shoes whispered against marble as she turned to leave, clutching her folded napkin like a secret. The street outside had the sharp bite of late spring. Taxis hissed, couples lingered, and the city exhaled neon promises. She had made it 2 steps off the curb before a voice, low, precisely measured, cut through the noise. "You're early to the wrong life." He stood like a carved silhouette in the doorway of the restaurant, a man whose presence suggested stories he had no intention of telling. He wore a coat tailored with old-world patience, the kind of coat that sat on shoulders like a second skin. The collar was turned slightly up, his hair was dark with a scatter of silver. And when he offered her a cigarette, though she didn't smoke, there was a disarming courtesy to the motion, as if he were inviting her into a small, private theater. She should have been wary. There was something about the way he stepped forward that was both deliberate and dangerous, controlled like a ship's captain who had learned to read storms. Yet in the small, absurd space between leaving and refusing, she found herself answering. "No, I was just stood up," he finished, and his voice had an accent that tilted old maps. "Sit. You are not obliged to leave sooner than you were promised." It was an odd line to deliver, an unfamiliar man advocating for basic human decency, and the absurdity broke something brittle in her. She laughed once, the sound a little flat at first, then softened. He insisted, ordered in that gentle, impossibly persuasive tone, on buying her a glass of champagne. He had the means, she could tell by the way he signed the slip with a name that looked like a crest, and, more importantly, by the small white gloves tucked in his pocket. He called the waiter, but did not shout. Everything about him suggested a practice in power so complete it had no need for noise. They retreated to a corner table. The restaurant's hum reshaped itself around them. For the first time since Marcus's text, Emily felt something unfurl in her chest, the possibility of being simply seen. He listened as she said, too quickly, though with conviction, what she wasn't looking for. No rescue, no fairy tale. She wanted honesty. She wanted small moments that meant something. "I would never call it rescue," he said when she finished. "Rescue implies you were drowning. You were waiting for a man to arrive at the wrong shore." The line felt like a mirror. She thought about how often she'd played the part quietly, smoothing over the edge of his temper, pretending the missing promises were merely misfiled. "What's your name?" she asked, the question coming out like a test. "Anthony," he said. He folded the name with his mouth like a word he had kept small and secret for so long it had acquired its own weather. He did not offer a surname. Instead, he studied her, careful as a man reading a ledger. The way he looked at her was not objectifying. It was cataloging worth with the same steadiness she gave to poems and pages. Their conversation moved like a river moving under ice, steady with hints of something more restless beneath. Anthony spoke in anecdotes that never quite reached confessional weight. A story about a childhood home with cracked plaster and a father who taught him to read the weather in other people's faces. When Emily talked about the classroom, about the way a shy student would read aloud and discover their voice, his expression softened into something almost like reverence. He understood being noticed. He had the nimble, patient attention of a reader who loved the careful reveal. By the time dessert arrived, an unexpected lemon tart that tasted like honest summers, they had made a cautious exchange of truths, small fragments, the way people test a bridge by putting one foot on it, then another. He was a man with a softly dangerous reputation. "You must have seen him in the papers," he said. And when she admitted she hadn't, he smiled wryly, as if that counted as a relief. "You are someone the tabloids like to mythologize," he went on, not apologetic, simply stating fact. "A man who keeps matters private, who values loyalty. People like to label things they don't understand." "That's a convenient brand," Emily said, half amused and half skeptical. "Is that—" She gestured toward the world beyond the glass, where midnight city silhouettes kept their secrets. "It keeps people safe," he said, and did not elaborate, which was itself an answer. The balance between what he offered and what he withheld was deliberate, and Emily found it perversely comforting. There was a code, and even in the vague sketches he gave, a sense that he followed it. When he invited her to continue the evening, "I have a friend who makes the best late-night coffee," she surprised herself. Not because she wanted to be courted or because she needed the spectacle of another rescuer, but because for the first time in months she wanted the quiet company of someone who listened without wanting to be fixed. She took the offer, and in a street lit by wet reflections, two strangers walked in the slow privacy of a city that was both indifferent and intimate. The limousine that arrived was unassuming, black, with soft leather that remembered previous passengers, and the driver regarded Anthony with a deferential distance that was not servility but recognition. When the car slid into motion, Anthony reached for her hand in a manner that was gentle and unapologetic. She let it rest there, an experiment in trust. At his place, if place was the right word, it felt more like a small sunlit world stacked above the city. They shed the remainder of the evening's performative armor. The penthouse seemed both modern and antique, with high ceilings and a library wall stacked with books that were the spine of his life. Sunflowers, unexpected in a space that otherwise favored muted palettes, leaned in a tall vase on the windowsill, their yellow heads like small suns. She found herself drawn to them, to the improbable, hopeful gesture in a man who cultivated mystery. When she touched a petal, it left a faint powder across her fingertip. Anthony poured 2 coffees and, with a candor that caught her off guard, told her he liked to drink them black and watch the city move in its own private cinema. "Do you mind if I look at your books?" she asked, because the shelf felt like a map. "Please," he said. "Pick one. If you find something you like, keep it. Consider it a loan, with generous terms." She wandered through the titles, the names a constellation of interests: history, poetry, travel, law. Her fingers paused on a slim volume of Neruda, then flitted to a battered children's book with a bright faded cover. A velvet box sat on a low table, closed and small. It seemed incongruous, but she did not pry. There were private things that people kept to themselves. She knew that as a teacher as well as a woman who had learned the economy of small reveals. They shared stories of losses and the funny, humiliating things that stitched people together. a botched recital, a student who once read their awkward first poem aloud and found applause. Anthony's confessions were edged with the kind of grief that did not want sympathy so much as recognition. Once, he paused mid-sentence and said, without dramatics, "I have not been very good at letting people in." The admission was thin as a thread, and she thought of the many small calibrations people made to keep from being abandoned again. He offered a photograph, not the glossy kind that tabloids used, but a small, battered black and white from a desk drawer. Parents on a porch, young and fierce with hope. Emily saw the way his hand tightened imperceptibly around the paper, the tiny falter of someone who still carried grief as one might carry a wound, distantly aware, often manageable, but always present. "I lost them when I was 20, he said, voice steady but softer. "It taught me two things, that loyalty is an inheritance and that grief is a map. You learn which roads to avoid." She thought of her own family, a father whose absence had the weight of a missing chapter, a mother who had tried and failed at the busy labor of staying. She understood what abandonment felt like in a small, domestic language, the dishes left in the sink, the unsent messages, the way promises evaporated. Listening to Anthony, she felt the map of her life reroute slightly. When he asked if she would stay the night, because the hour had thickened into something that preferred the company of fabrics and books, she refused at first with the polite clarity of someone who kept herself intact. "I teach tomorrow," she said. "I can't be the person who disappears." He understood and did not press. Instead, he walked her to the door with a slow, exacting care and gave her a small, signed card with the name of his private driver and a number. "If you ever need anything, an errand, a book, a safe cup of coffee, call," he said. It wasn't a command masked as favor. It was a careful offering, like someone setting a single plate across a table and asking permission to sit. She took the card. Her fingers remembered how it felt to be noticed without being owned. 2 days later, a small envelope arrived at the school where she taught, delivered with the unobtrusive certainty of someone who had rehearsed discretion. Inside was a slim ticket stub from an art gallery's exclusive opening and a handwritten note that said only, "For the quiet ones, 7 p.m. Friday." No signature, no explanation. It was the kind of invitation that asked for a choice and refused to guilt her into compliance. Emily looked at the ticket, then at the clock on her classroom wall, then at the faces of her students rearranging the world into innocent categories. She kept the ticket. She kept the possibility. Over the next week, their exchanges were punctuated and precise, a message of a book recommendation, a discarded photograph of a cityscape sent at dawn, a bouquet of sunflowers on her doorstep with a note that read, "They seemed stubbornly hopeful." Each gesture was calibrated to feel like someone responding with the right size gesture, big enough to matter, small enough to be safe. They had a second, gentler date at a bookstore that smelled of paper and dust, the kind of place where time softened. Anthony followed her as she wandered aisles, occasionally reading a spine and chuckling at the absurdities of life captured in print. He bought her a small used volume of short stories that she loved, his way of leaving a mark that could not be read by tabloid eyes. Afterward, they ate greasy fries from a food truck, elbows sticky, and laughed at the unglamorous, real way their conversation sounded when it wasn't honed for optics. These small scenes, the bookstore, the late-night coffee, the penthouse with its sunflowers, formed a pattern that was not rescue, not siege, but a deliberate mutuality. In the quiet, she tested the edges of him. When she asked about the rumors, he neither flinched nor lied. "I have enemies who prefer fiction," he said once, looking at the city as if it were an old, complex book. "Rumor is a sort of currency. I am careful how I spend mine." "Are you dangerous?" she asked, because curiosity is a teacher's constant. He considered the question like a man assessing a fine tool. "I have been described in many ways. Dangerous is a word people use when what they fear is losing order. I am not an instruction manual for fear." That should have satisfied her. The problem was not his present comportment. It was the question of what lay behind the curtain. He was a man who cultivated silence like a rare plant. It made him magnetic and opaque in equal measure. Their first kiss came in the shadowed warmth of a small gallery opening that smelled of turpentine and good wine. She had put on the blue dress again because it felt true to some part of herself she wanted to keep intact. Candles made small moons on every table. People navigated the room in low conversations, analyzing lines of color as if meaning were a syntax accessible by the right eye. In the corner, a portrait of a woman with a sunflower behind her ear stared out with painted calm. Marcus found them there. Not the man who had sent the cruel text, he was a smaller actor in a larger play, but the real Marcus, late, flustered, lips forming old apologies. He appeared like an afterthought, a figure in the gallery's periphery, and at first Emily's chest went into the private, practiced rhythm of someone who had been wronged before. The old temporal script, that desperate need to smooth things, to accept tokens in lieu of truth, pulled like a familiar gravity. Anthony watched Marcus approach, his eyes narrowing a fraction, not in anger, but in assessment. When Marcus's words came, awkward, possessive, half an apology and half accusation, Emily felt something like a release. She no longer moved in the old pattern. She spoke differently now, clipped and honest. "This isn't about you," she said, voice steadier than she felt.
"What you did was your choice. It's not mine to answer." Marcus stumbled through protests, but around them the gallery murmured. People liked scandal as a seasoning. Phones raised, some discreet, some shameless, caught the moment. Emily standing with a man who had the look of a rumor, Marcus behind her with the look of a regret that had not aged well. A photographer, perhaps one who smelled a headline, stepped through the crowd and took a single photograph. Emily at Anthony's side, her jaw set, a sunflower in a painting behind them like ironic punctuation. Anthony did not move to hide or to interpose. He stood steady and unblinking, not a shield, but a statement. The gallery buzzed for a while. Then the crowd shifted, and the image began its own life and pixels and whispers. Later, when the high, hot wave of attention faded for the evening, Anthony walked her to the coat area and offered his arm. "I would like to build something honest," he said, suddenly small in his confession, "if you let me." The offer was not the kind that erased her past or overwrote the reality that she favored autonomy. Instead, it was a proposition of pace and respect. He liked rituals. He believed in small things done well. She wanted to believe in that too. "I don't want to be saved," she replied. "I want to be chosen." He smiled in a way that recognized the difference. "Then choose poorly and often," he said, and kissed her, lightly, like permission. The gallery photograph landed online the next morning, shared by a dozen accounts and captioned in various registers. Mysterious Dawn, Teacher and Rumor, Tabloid Gold. Her students learned before she could tell them. The cafeteria hummed with whispered speculation. She was a teacher, the adult anchor in a sea of adolescent upheaval. And yet suddenly, her name had become a headline swallowed by algorithms. Her phone hot with messages, her email pinging with curiosity, and the thin malice of strangers, Emily realized that intimacy with a man like Anthony came with collateral noise. That was the cost of visibility. She had known it intellectually. What she hadn't known was how quickly the noise could translate into real consequence. Within days, a photograph of her in the blue dress, arm tucked within Anthony's elbow, was a banner on a gossip site. Comments ranged from protective to scathing. Someone, somewhere, had decided a teacher who moved in certain circles was a teacher whose judgment was suspect. The school administrator called with the measured concern of bureaucracy, not malice. "We need to be careful, Emily. Perception matters." "Perception shouldn't define me," she said into the receiver. She was calm, professional, reasonable. Inside, she felt the cold prickle of being judged in the place where she ministered to 15-year-olds learning the grammar of their own lives. The first wave of fallout came in small ways. A parent wrote an email asking whether her extracurriculars remained appropriate. An anonymous blog raised questions about favoritism.
For all that the world had offered Anthony in the way of power, he did not use it to retaliate. Instead, he offered to meet, discreetly, with the principal, to explain, to allay concerns. Emily made him an offer of her own. She would handle the classroom. She would make a statement if necessary. She refused to be relocated or silenced by the buzz. "I won't be paraded," she told him in one of their late calls. "I won't have my life squeezed into a thumbnail." His voice in the dark hours was close and honest. "I would not wish scandal on you. I value something more than rumor." Those words collected like a pledge. She believed him enough to step into the next weeks with a guarded openness. She would not be rescued into silence. She would walk forward on her own feet, and if he wanted to walk beside her, he could, but responsibility was hers. Then, like a storm that learns the geography of a town, trouble arrived more pointedly. A package appeared on her doorstep during a weekday, small, unremarkable, wrapped in brown paper. Inside there was a single stem, dry, brittle, of a sunflower, its petals browned at the edges as if sunburned by someone else's light. There was no note. The sunflower had once been a bright, hopeful thing in Anthony's penthouse. Now, in its wilted form at her front steps, it felt like a message. She called him and left a voice that was steady with the professional detachment she used when directing school plays. "Someone left a dead sunflower on my steps." There was a pause on the other end, long and inhabited. When Anthony spoke, his voice was low and rapid, the controlled cadence replaced by a flash of something like anger that he swallowed quickly. "Report it," he said. "I'll have someone check on the building's cameras. Document everything. Do not touch anything else." "I don't want you to." "You told me once not to presume," he interrupted softly. "I'm not presuming. I'm offering to help." She hung up, palms damp, the sunflower now an echo of the earlier living ones in his penthouse. The petals reminded her of all the small, stubborn signs people left to announce a presence. Threats, when they were anonymous, had the peculiar cruelty of being a universal accusation. Prove you are not afraid. The dead sunflower was the beginning of a pattern. An anonymous email followed, a blurred photograph of Anthony outside a building she did not recognize, and a caption that implied things without saying them aloud. The message was clear. Proximity has a cost. Emily felt the knot of it, a pressure tightening at the base of her throat. She could, as any practical person would, go to the police. She could document and file and press. She could remove herself from the equation. She could also panic. She sat at her kitchen table and wrote a list of options, the way she organized thoughts for a lesson plan. Call the school, tell the principal, contact the police, change locks. No, retain normalcy for as long as possible. Do not let fear be the master. When a press outlet called with a polite, searching voice, "Is it true you are involved with Anthony Sinclair?" Emily made a choice. She would not be reduced to a whisper of rumor. She would not allow the inertia of the story to write her as someone gullible or complicit. She called Anthony and asked the question that had been simmering in the background. "Who are you to the world I'm becoming?" He answered, not with a label, but with a careful truth. "I am a man with a reputation. I have tried to shed some of it. I will not drag you into anything that endangers you." "And if your attempt to shed your reputation makes you a target," she asked, "what then?" "Then we plan," he said. "Then we act like the people who have been careful in this town all their lives. We document, we follow legal channels. We do not leave you to be the one who carries the story alone." There was a steadiness to his words, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the small comfort of an ally. But she also felt the weight of consequences beginning to gather like storm clouds. She would not ask him to clear the sky for her, and he would not pretend he could. There were other forces at play. A woman named Victoria Sterling, someone Emily had heard of in passing, a COO whose name appeared like a stamp on every rumor-laden business report, began to appear in the periphery of social chatter as someone who benefited from scandal. Marcus's last, petulant texts kept arriving like small bruises of sound. "You don't know him," they said. "He'll ruin you." Emily threw herself into work as one throws oneself at a stabilizing rope, with method and a grim, steady hand. She refused to be rehearsed into fear. But when the school's principal asked if she would consider a statement for the parents' sake, Emily felt again the collision of personal choice and public duty. She wrote a statement that afternoon that was honest, limited, and firm. She was an adult making adult choices. The classroom would be held to the same standards as before. There would be no spectacle. The press outlet's initial query breathed and moved, then retreated, enough to set the machine in motion, but not enough to give it teeth. In the interim, the dead sunflower continued to burn small in her mind. She began to notice small things more acutely: cars that waited too long near her street, an unremarkable man who seemed to take the same route past her gate twice in a day. Her life, which had once been measured by essay deadlines and classroom applause, acquired a new metric: the count of unremarkable events that, assembled, built a pattern of attention. Anthony responded by turning his attention into concrete measures: security cameras, polite visits from aides who carried a quiet authority, and messages that were both protective and respectful of her autonomy. He refused to isolate her with force or spectacle. He set boundaries with a calm stringent as law. Yet he could not control everything. Information had an ungovernable life of its own in the city. It traveled like smoke, finding every crack. One morning, a photograph of Emily's classroom surfaced online, taken from an angle that implied an intimacy with Anthony he would not deny, and the commentary looped around her like a tide. Her students asked the questions they could not help but ask: "Is this true? Are you okay?" She answered them with the clarity of someone who teaches honesty: "I am fine. I am choosing my life." After class, a girl named Mara, bright, awkward, admirable, stayed behind and asked to talk. She had seen the online comments and wanted to be sure her teacher was more than the noise. Mara reached out, small fingers clasping a crumpled page of a book. "I liked the poem today, Miss Johnson," she said. "I wanted you to know that." That sentence, uncomplicated, generous, kept Emily from sinking in a way none of the strategic measures could. There was the world, the private one of small human exchange, and then there was the rumor machine. The two did not have to be enemies. In the quiet that followed the classroom's departure, Emily found herself back in the blue dress in her head again, the one that had hung like a memory in her closet. She thought about Anthony reading her the names of poets she taught. She thought about the velvet box she'd seen and how easily people mistake objects for promises. She thought, too, about her father, Robert Johnson, absent for most of her life, who had resurfaced months earlier like a tide that wanted something. His return had seemed tentative at first: phone calls with awkward cadence, offers of lunch. She had allowed him, in small doses, back into the perimeter of their lives. She did not know if it was wise. On a Friday night, 2 weeks after the dead sunflower, Emily sat at a small cafe, fingers wrapped around a paper cup. The city had weathered the gossip. The storm had not broken, but the clouds had become a consistent presence. She checked her phone out of habit. One message stood out, deliberate and perfunctory: a PDF attached, titled transaction_PDF, the type of dry, bureaucratic file one would not expect to find in a personal inbox. She opened it, curiosity piqued despite the heaviness that had become her companion. The document was a compilation of transfers, small, obsessive payments that read like a ledger of someone else's attentions. At the bottom, a single line hovered like a sinister punctuation: a payment traced to Robert Johnson from a shell account associated with a rival group she had never heard named, but whose edges smelled of opportunism. Her chest went cold. Her father, the man who had been absent most of her life and who, when present, seemed to be learning how to be plausible again. Marcus had been petty, but this suggested something crueler and far more intentional. She felt the familiar teacher's impulse, the need to document and plan. She put the file away and made a list: call Anthony, call the police, meet her father, and ask him to explain. Then she added, as if writing to herself in the margin of a lesson, Do not let this steal your voice. She sat there for a long time, feeling the city go on around her, 1,000 small dramas played out in repeating loops. Her life, once measured in lesson plans, in the small triumphs of a child learning to read, had been pulled into a public orbit where reputation had a life of its own. She tasted the metallic tang of fear and decided she would not swallow it whole. Her decision was a tiny act of reclaiming. She texted Anthony a short message. "We need to talk. Not tonight, soon. There is something I need to say." His answer came almost immediately, simple and unadorned. "I'll be there. Bring the ledger." When he arrived 2 nights later, he looked at the documents with a coolness that was part professional habit and part private grief. He did not leap to accusations. He cataloged, he cross-referenced. He made calls with a hushed efficiency that suggested he had practiced this kind of careful attention for years. He did not promise to vanish rumors with a snap, he never did. But he mapped out sensible steps. Document, inform, involve counsel. "We will do this without spectacle," he said. "People like to mistake drama for resolution." Emily listened, grateful for the steadiness, but aware that even the most honest measures invited new kinds of theater. She was not helpless, she was an agent. She would not allow her decisions to be entirely managed by men who thought they could control every variable of her life. Anthony respected that in her. He had limits. He offered his influence in measured doses that did not overrule her agency. In the days that followed, as they walked the narrow border between private life and public perception, a small intimacy deepened. Less fireworks than the accumulation of understated gestures. He left a copy of a book she'd once assigned in class on her desk with a note. "For the class who made me remember a simple line." She cooked him a meal once, an awkward, splendid attempt at risotto that made them laugh, and he told the story of learning to cook after nights too empty to bear. They traded small vulnerabilities that felt like currency far more valuable than money. The pattern had the glow of cautious hope, but it also smelled faintly of war. Warnings came in the form of an anonymous tip to a gossip site, then a series of dark photos posted under an edited handle. Anthony in a dim hallway, a hand on a shoulder, the caption suggesting impropriety. It felt like a bellwether. People misinterpreted what they could not see. Emily made choices. She continued to go to work. She asked the principal to issue a statement of support for her. She called her father and asked the question she had been circling for weeks. Robert's answers were slippery. He claimed confusion, poor documentation, a misunderstanding. "Emily, can you not make this into something it is not?" he said, the voice thin with practiced hurt. There was a way he performed his inability to be comprehensible when it suited him, and she recognized it, like a teacher recognizing a student's pattern of avoidance when confronted. "You worked with them," she said quietly, closing the distance. "This payment is from a stranger's account." "People move money all the time for charity, Emily," he said. "I do," she replied, the teacher in her voice now steadier than the child who had once waited by a phone. "But this is different. I will find out." She would not sing a childlike song of vindication. She would devise a plan with evidence and integrity. That resolve felt like wearing a new coat, one that fit and had pockets for everything she would need. Then came the final curiosity of the week, a velvet box on her doorstep. No note, no explanation. It was small, heavy with a presence like a question. Inside, wrapped in tissue, lay a single cufflink shaped like a miniature sunflower, fashioned with old metal and a crest she did not recognize. The cufflink was a private, intimate thing, intended by whoever sent it to suggest connection. It was also, for Emily, an incitement that smoldered with a challenge. She took a photograph and sent it to Anthony. His response was instantaneous, the tension in his message palpable. Do not accept or return anything, he wrote. Keep everything as it is. Document. Let it be evidence. That night she slept badly, waking again and again to the city's siren song. She had not asked to become a public story. She had not wanted to be a symbol. Yet here she was, a small woman with a chalk-stained hand and a stubborn belief in stories, caught in the high, cruel glare of rumor. The dead sunflower, the velvet box, the ledger entries, each a stitch in a fabric she had not chosen. Each one made her choices more urgent, more visible. She stood at the classroom door the next morning and looked back at the empty desks. In the noise of adolescent chatter, she found a small, steady line. You teach like you live, Mara had once said, like you believe people can change. She repeated the thought to herself like a prayer, and thought, suddenly, of the man who had quoted Neruda and left a copy of a book on her desk. A choice then. She would not be silenced. She would not vanish. She would walk into the center of the next storm with her eyes open and with her voice ready. She straightened the blue dress in the mirror before leaving, smoothing the fabric like the surface of something she intended to tend. Later that evening, as she walked up the steps of her stoop, she found an envelope tucked under the mat. Its flap was sealed with a smudge of wax, stamped with a crest she did not at first recognize. Inside were photographs, grainy, cropped, of a place she knew only from the headlines, the plant on the east side where Anthony's companies had once done legitimate shipping work. One photo showed a scaffolding in disarray, another showed a list of names with certain lines circled in red. Emily felt a prickle of something like vertigo. The images suggested intent. They suggested danger. She held them against the light and could not make them into anything comforting. Her hands trembled not because she was afraid of Anthony, for she trusted him in the small, accumulating ways that matter, but because these pictures felt like a strategy, the kind of instrument that could be wielded to destroy people who stood in the way of a different narrative. She called him. "When are you leaving?" she asked, breathless. "I'm on my way," he said. He came quickly, not with a show, but with the kind of quiet authority that gathers people who know how to keep peace without force. He looked at the photographs, and his face, usually a controlled plane of patience, hardened for an instant into something like cold determination. "We document," he said. "We do this with the police. You are not alone in this." She believed him, but she also believed in taking her part. Her agency was not a thing to hand over. She would stand. She would be seen and heard, but not victimized into silence. The velvet box and dead sunflower had become markers in a game she had not agreed to play. She would set the terms. They made lists, they called counsel, they spoke with a detective whose kindness had the bluntness of duty. The evidence gathered like mud in the cogs of a mechanism. Anthony's name made the gossip columns richer, but the photographic evidence and the ledger suggested a human hand behind a campaign of ruin. That was the scariest part. Someone close enough to weave the threads had to be in possession of the map. "They go after what they think they can break," Anthony said late that night, his hand resting on the small of her back, not gripping, only present. "They test the edges. You're resilient, but you don't have to be alone." She nodded. "I won't be alone," she said. They did not speak of forever in that moment. The stakes were too real for platitudes. Instead, they planned. A city moves by ordinance and quiet, and they would use its gears. Within those plans was a quieter accord, one that had less to do with security and more with belonging. If this became a long road, they would walk it together, step by step, with respect and no promises that reduced the work of love to mythology. They made lists, they called counsel, they spoke with a detective whose kindness had the bluntness of duty. The evidence gathered like mud in the cogs of a mechanism. Anthony's name made the gossip columns richer, but the photographic evidence in the ledger suggested a human hand behind a campaign of ruin. That was the scariest part. Someone close enough to weave the threads had to be in possession of the map. "They go after what they think they can break," Anthony said late that night, his hand resting on the small of her back, not gripping, only present. "They test the edges. You're resilient,
But you don't have to be alone. She nodded. I won't be alone, she said. They did not speak of forever in that moment. The stakes were too real for platitudes. Instead, they planned. A city moves by ordinance and quiet, and they would use its gears. Within those plans was a quieter accord, one that had less to do with security and more with belonging. If this became a long road, they would walk it together, step by step, with respect and no promises that reduced the work of love to mythology.
When Anthony left that night, he pressed something into her hand, a small, battered book he had marked with a single sunflower sketch on a blank page, and the words, simply, "For when things look like they won't, A." It was not a declaration, it was an offering. She kept it like a talisman. 2 days later, the school's board announced a meeting to discuss community concerns. The press began to whisper about the possibility of a formal inquiry. Her father's number showed up on her phone with a call she almost ignored, but did not. He asked if she had seen the news. His voice carried that practiced mixture of guilt and calculation. This could be an opportunity, he said, which made her chest ache with a recognition she had learned well. When Robert Johnson spoke of opportunity, it usually meant someone else would be exploited for his appetite. Emily closed her eyes and breathed in the small steadiness she had cultivated. Books, coffee, Mara's gratitude. She would not be someone else's map. She would be the cartographer of her own life. That night, as she prepared to stand in front of people who would ask questions she did not yet have all the answers to, she put the blue dress on again. She pinned the sunflower sketch into the inside seam of the dress so that when she moved, the tiny sketch would press against her skin like a secret pledge. She pinned it there and touched the blue fabric once, as if blessing the day she had decided to stand in front of whatever crowd would come and speak as herself. The board meeting felt like standing on a stage under a different kind of light. Parents clustered into folding chairs, their faces a field of worry and curiosity. Cameras waited in the doorway like patient flies. The superintendent introduced the session with the bureaucratic softness of someone trying to keep truth from tearing too quickly at delicate things. Emily sat at the small table with a stack of papers she had prepared, a calm, concrete chronology of events, emails, the dead sunflower photograph, the ledger she had found. She had rehearsed the opening sentences in the mirror a dozen times, not to sound heroic, but to sound human. When her turn came, she read without theatrics. She explained the facts as she knew them, and then, with the steadiness of someone who had taught adolescents to find meaning in language, she named what mattered most: her classroom's integrity, the safety and growth of her students, and the simple choice she had made to live openly, even under scrutiny. "I am a teacher," she said plainly. "I am also an adult whose life will not be reduced to the margins of someone else's rumors. My students deserve my honesty, not secrecy. If my choices have made anyone uncomfortable, I will answer questions and be transparent, but I will not be shamed for existing." There was a low murmur that ran through the room, some sympathetic, some skeptical, but that did not pull at her. She had spoken the thing she had chosen. When the principal thanked her and called for a break, a hand came down on the back of her chair. Anthony's presence in the gallery seat was a quiet punctuation. He rose and did not speak. He only offered his shoulder as a place in the crowd to attach herself, an unintrusive line of support. Outside, the press smelled the implied drama and pressed for remarks. Emily answered 3 brief questions with the same cadence she'd used in class: honest, bounded, direct. Someone asked the inevitable, "Are you dating Mr. Sinclair?" The phrasing was designed to compress her into an explanation she did not owe. She gave a short, courteous answer: "I am living my life. I will not let rumor write my responsibilities for me." The cameras captured the exchange, and then, inevitably, the image widened into the ebb of public curiosity. Her phone lit like a constellation for the next few days.
Yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt the strange, quiet kinship of someone who had deliberately decided not to hide when the world expected her to. If you like stories of people who choose themselves in the middle of scandal, stay with this one. That soft request floated out of her mouth somewhere between the boardroom and the parking lot. It was not a plea for attention. It was a tether for anyone who felt seen by her refusal to vanish. It was the single, small CTA she allowed, an invitation for the witness to continue. The weeks that followed were a calculus in patience. Investigators, state police, and private counsel began to stitch together the pattern of harassment, the anonymous emails, the dead sunflower, the velvet box, the cufflink. Anthony's resources moved like a careful tide. Lawyers who spoke the language of fact, security who handled evidence, a respectful distance from the sensational. He would not, she learned, turn his influence into a hammer for his private uses. He used it to open doors properly, to expedite a subpoena, to insist an officer take a report seriously. That was one of the ways he was different from rumor. There was a code in his actions, a measured refrain of respect for law's processes. And yet whatever they could do legally could not entirely close the gap that had been opened between rumor and life. Anonymous stories began to appear in outlets that trafficked in scandal. The tabloid cycle is a hungry thing. Images reworked, phrases exaggerated. A journalist reached out with a soft tone and a hard question. Is it true your involvement with Mr. Sinclair led to favoritism? She refused to be baited. No, she answered. My classroom remains open to every child who shows up. The campaign against them did not falter, it evolved. Where initially the attacks had been personal and sneaky, they became strategic and surgical. The plant on the east side, one of the oldest buildings in the industrial district, and a place where Anthony's legitimate shipping holdings had once been concentrated, saw a series of minor incidents. Failed inspections reported by anonymous tips, a scaffold cable found cut but not yet collapse, EMT calls for minor injuries. It had the arc of escalation, a small outrage, a threat, and then something that rose into terror. The collapse happened on a rain-week Tuesday. A section of the outer loading platform, old but in the middle of a scheduled upgrade, gave way during a shift change. It was not an explosion. It was a sudden, terrible rip. Scaffolding betrayed by unseen tampering, bolts that had been loosened and then reintegrated so the failure would read like an accident. Workers fell, alarms screamed. The plant's floor became a map of confusion and metal and human noise. Anthony wasn't there when it happened. He arrived within minutes, a figure cutting diagonally through the emergency lane, with his coat unbuttoned and his face stripped of the cultivated reserve he used for social rooms. He moved with a purpose that pulled people like weather. His aides coordinated with emergency crews, his corporate counsel handled insurance notices, a logistics manager opened the ledger for the rescue team, and he walked among the injured with hands that steadied as they checked pulses and shouted directions. There was no glamour to it, just a brutal, immediate insistence on protecting bodies. Emily watched the broadcast on her kitchen television and felt something like vertigo. The footage was raw, emergency personnel carrying stretchers, a worker gripping a colleague's hand, the camera reflecting the wet lights. Her phone filled with messages, concerns and condolences in equal measure. She called Anthony, and he answered with the cadence of a man who'd been in storms before. I'm at the site, he said. They are doing triage. The first responders are in place. Are they okay? Emily asked, voice tight. Some are hurt, he said. We are getting them medical care. No lives lost so far. But this was deliberate, Emily. Someone made it look like an accident. His words were a brittle admission. The plant's board called an emergency meeting. The police widened their investigation. For Emily, the collapse became a test of all the things she had been trying to keep. The commitment to speak her truth and the insistence not to be rewritten. She feared for the injured men and women, for the family members who would learn their lives had been altered. She feared, too, the way the city's narrative machines would use this blight to paint everything in charcoal.
Anthony insisted that every legal channel be used to find the perpetrators. He worked with forensics, engineers who examined the metal, electricians who followed the wiring, and a private investigator who had once worked on corporate fraud cases but now specialized in linking money trails to people. They found the first thread in the ledger Emily had discovered. Corporate-sounding shell accounts, payments disguised as municipal fees, and, most damning, a transfer that led, through a chain of intermediaries, to an account ultimately controlled from an address traceable to Robert Johnson. When the detective called Emily in to ask questions, she sat across from him in a fluorescent-lit room and spoke in the same measured tone she'd begun to adopt in the face of rumor. He showed her photos, security camera stills of a man arriving near the plant in a nondescript sedan the day the bolts had been loosened. The face in the grainy image had the same chin, the same hesitant gait she'd seen in the photos Robert used for his grandfatherly Facebook posts. It was small things that built this case: the ledger entry, the wax seal impression on that envelope, the cufflink with the old crest. One of the cufflinks, magnified in police photos, had a tiny nick on its rim, an imperfection that matched the velvet box cufflink found on Robert's workbench after a simple warrant. The evidence moved like a prairie fire. Robert's name did not carry the weight it once might have. It carried the precise sting of betrayal. He had come back into her life as if to resettle a house that had been abandoned. Instead, he had been carrying calculations, loans, favors, leverage, designed by someone else or designed by his appetite. The police issued a subpoena. Robert tried to explain. He sounded contrite and vague, and then, as the net closed, defensive. When questioned under oath, his statements tangled. The more he tried to justify himself, the more his tracks recorded. Emily wanted to be furious, and she wanted to be distracted, and she wanted to be empty. Instead, she found in herself a complicated tenderness for a man who had been both absent and now ruminous. She wanted answers that would not come in easy absolutions. When the detective placed the final stack of documents on the table, bank transfers, timestamps, a recorded phone call where Robert's voice could be heard agreeing to terms, her hands did not tremble. She read the transcripts and felt her body calibrate to the ache of being wronged by someone who had been permitted too much latitude. "So he did it?" she asked at last, not as an accusation, but as a way of shaping the fact. The detective nodded. He coordinated with someone to make it look like an accident. The payments were the proof. We're taking him in. Arrest is a public thing. It has the theater of handcuffs and fluorescent lights and the peculiar privacy of pages of facts slipped into public records. Robert's face as he was led away was a mixture of shock and a certain brittle self-righteousness. He had been the man who taught her to cross streets and told stories of small wonders. Now he was a man whose small wonders had damaged people. Emily confronted him in a visitation room, years of absent conversations folding into a single tense hour. He apologized, of course. The sentence was practiced. "I thought I could fix things," he said. "I thought if I made moves that shifted power." "But you didn't make things better," she said, her voice a sharpened tool, not to break him, but to claim what was true. "You weaponized absence. You used what you knew I could not afford to fight to make money for other people. People were hurt." "I didn't think they'd," he started. "You counted on that not happening," she finished. "You counted on me not being the kind of person who would stand up and ask questions. You were wrong." His eyes, for a moment, were a young man's remorse. "I am sorry," he said. She listened to the apology and kept her own counsel. Forgiveness did not arrive like a tidal rush. It arrived later, in a different shape, not as absolution, but as a release of control. She wanted to forgive him so she could stop checking for his approval. She wanted to free herself from the way his absence had taught her to appease. That day, she told him, "I will not let you be the story that defines me." She did not hug him. She did not allow fantasy. She closed the door of the room with a quietness that was final enough. The public reaction to the collapse, and then to the revelation that her father had been involved, was an ugly thing and a cleansing thing at the same time. The tabloids who had fed on scandal now had the meat of hypocrisy and greed. They reported Robert's arrest with the ferocity of gossip finding facts. Commentators debated motives like armchair jurors. But amid the white noise, a more important thing happened. The investigators found a chain of payments connecting other actors who had an interest in undermining Anthony's legitimacy. Victoria Sterling, it turned out, had business interests that intersected with those rivals. She had not been the architect of the sabotage, but her opportunism had opened doors for people who wanted to destabilize Anthony's legitimate holdings. She resigned under the pressure of a shareholder inquiry and offered, later in an awkward public statement, a contrite apology that read like a legal script. There were legal hearings and internal investigations. The public's appetite shifted from psychic satisfaction to the dull grind of court calendars and depositions. Lawsuits were filed, restraining orders sought, and evidence shared with prosecutors who, to their credit, moved with both speed and prudence. Anthony, who could have tried to bury questions with money and influence, chose instead to make the company's books and practices transparent. He invited regulators for inspections, he named an independent compliance officer, and he testified in a way that balanced privacy with the obligation to the public. He accepted consequences where due and worked to remedy the harm done to the injured workers, with medical funds, scholarships for their children, and the creation of a safety task force for the industry. Watching him at the hearing, formal, composed, and a man who risked his reputation more by telling truth than by hiding, Emily saw the difference between rumor and real character. He did not use his power to twist the law, he used it to make amends. The televised interview she gave was, by her arrangement, not a spectacle but a conversation. A reputable network reached out, and after she consulted with counsel, she agreed to speak. She sat under a soft light and took a breath that tasted of lemon tart and wet spring. Cameras were on, but the moment she had created for herself was never about performance. It was about reclamation. "I am a teacher," she said into the microphone that felt suddenly heavy with responsibility. "I am also someone who loves people in messy, imperfect ways. I chose to meet someone who listened. I did not ask for my life to be weaponized, and neither did I ask to be defined by someone else's manipulations. I will not be a public curiosity when people's lives are at stake." She spoke of autonomy and agency, and of the quiet dignity of ordinary work. When she reached the passage about forgiveness, she surprised herself by how gentle she sounded. "Forgiveness is not a shortcut," she told the host. "It is a decision made day by day. I choose to forgive because I want to be the writer of my life, not because I pity someone who would rather be in charge of my chapters." The interview circulated widely, but it landed differently than a tabloid bite. People felt the honesty of her voice. Messages poured in, not just from women who said they recognized themselves in her stead, but from students and parents who had watched her in class and felt the continuity between the woman who graded essays and the woman who had the courage to speak on television. For Emily, the most meaningful notes were the ones from Mara, who wrote, "I told my mom today what poetry means. You made me do that. Thank you." Those messages brought back the lesson of why she had chosen to do this public work, to teach, to be a model of refusal to be reduced. Anthony watched her interview in the quiet of his office. A thin ache moved across his face. It was not the callousness of someone unconcerned with outrage. It was the loneliness of a man who had learned that power could not replace the small, vulnerable acts of being present. After the interview aired, he called. "You were clear," he said. "You were yourself. That is what matters." "I did not want you to fix it," she replied, meaning what she said. "I wanted you to stand with me." "So I will stand," he said, "without making the choice for you." They kept to the rules they had made for themselves.
He did not sweep her away to a safe island. He offered practical help when it was wanted and retreated gracefully when it wasn't. Their relationship had become a mutual project of boundaries and tenderness. When the dust settled enough for them to breathe, Anthony suggested a retreat, not as an escape, but as a place to be quiet together. Tuscany, he said casually, as if naming a private room of the world, a place where the sky is honest and the food makes you slow down. She almost laughed at the sincerity of it. Is this your way of saying you want to be less of a rumor and more of a slow Sunday? In part, he said, mostly because there is a pocket of earth that has no expectations of us. They traveled when the prosecutor's calendar permitted and when the respirations of the public had dulled into a grudging curiosity that allowed for private life. Tuscany received them without fanfare. It was, in many ways, everything a person needs when they are trying to remember the small things. Stone roads warm underfoot, a farmhouse that smelled of yeast and wood, a local market where vendors argued about the ripeness of peaches. Away from the city, Anthony's old-world manners came into play in sweeter ways. He preferred to walk at a measured pace and to listen without filling silences. He taught her to drive a small rented car along the hill routes, laughing when she missed a turn, and then turned the error into a detour that led them to a vineyard where an old man sold jam from a wooden stall. They learned new rituals, Sunday breakfasts that stretched into afternoons, lending and returning a book by the kitchen window, picking sunflowers from a field that nodded like a congregation. Sunflowers, of course, found their place in the trip's quiet grammar. Fields of them swayed in late August light, and Anthony would watch Emily watching the flowers as if he were reading a long, private poem. One evening, after a quiet dinner of pasta and an animated conversation about children who read aloud in class, they walked between rows of vines with the sky bruised gold. In the city, gestures become currency, Anthony said suddenly. People count them like interest. Out here, a gesture is simply bread. She smiled. You still owe me a good lemon tart. I have a list, he answered, and I will pay. They sat on a low stone wall, and she rested her head briefly on his shoulder. He turned to her in the dim of the lingering light and said something that surprised them both, not an orchestration or a pronouncement, but a small, honest thing. I don't know how to do all the things I would like to learn, but I want to learn them. I want to learn how to be present without theater. She could see the rawness beneath the cultivated reserve. You don't have to be perfect, she told him. You have to be real. He reached into his pocket and took out a velvet box, the very one she had noticed months earlier on his low table in the penthouse. He had kept it sealed like a memory until the scene felt right. He opened it to reveal a simple ring, not ostentatious, but made with old hands and a sunflower motif engraved on the inside. He did not kneel. He did not produce a speech polished by scriptwriters. He simply offered the small box like an offering. Emily, he said, voice steady, I will not promise to protect you from everything. I can promise to choose you, every day, with your permission. I will not make you smaller for my comfort. I will not make you a trophy to be shown. Will you marry me? The question landed not as "don't ask you," but as an invitation. It held all the terms they had been shaping: respect, agency, mutuality. She thought of the blue dress and the pinned sunflower sketch, of a father who had betrayed her trust, and of a man who had shown up not to steal her story, but to stand with her while she lived it. Yes, she said, and the single syllable had the weight of all the hard choices she'd made. Yes, if we keep asking each other, constantly, whether this is what we truly want. He laughed, a sound like something finally admitted into a room. He slid the ring onto her finger with a careful tenderness. And then, for a long time, they simply sat and watched the sun go down. The wedding they planned was not a tabloid headline. It was a small, intimate ceremony in the backyard of a small house in the countryside. Sunflowers arranged like a casual congregation, a few close friends,
Mara reading a poem as a tiny, unofficial representative of Emily's classroom. Elena Sinclair, Anthony's mother, stood quietly at the edge of the circle, and her presence was an act of reconciliation. She had reached out during the turmoil, sending a handwritten note about patience and the music of slow forgiveness. Victoria Sterling did not attend. She had cleared her public plate with a resignation and a later letter of contrition. Marcus watched the announcement from a distance, and then, with most of his bluster drained, moved on to a life that no longer involved Emily. The press were respectfully kept away. A single photographer, a friend of a friend, captured their smiles and later sent them an album with no intention of public release. On the day they said their vows, Emily wore the blue dress, not the same one, but a new one that echoed the color of the dress that had first held light over an empty chair. She had pinned the tiny sunflower sketch into its seam as a private talisman. She walked down a narrow path that smelled of grass and lemon zest and met the man who had, in the space between rumor and fact, taught her one of the most radical things: the courage to choose. They said small vows, true vows. Anthony promised to respect her work and to ask before acting. She promised to name the boundaries she needed and to keep her classrooms honest. When they exchanged rings, their hands were steady, consenting, and equal. Afterward, in the soft gathering where food was eaten and little speeches made, Emily thought back to the first night, 47 minutes of waiting, when a text had unmade a future and a stranger had called her back into her life with the odd, blunt line, "He will regret losing you." It had at once felt like an insult and a prophecy. Now, in the warm fold of the afternoon, she thought about how the line had both been true and been reframed. It had been true because Marcus did indeed feel the absence of someone who had been his quiet comfort and choose other paths. It had been reframed because the man who made the statement had never promised to be her rescuer. He had made a different promise, that he would show her that she mattered. If the line ever became a headline, the version she preferred was this: "Being left alone opens room for someone else to find you, but you are never a passive trophy in that exchange. You are the author of your acceptance." Years later, when she read the letter from one of her former students who had become a poet of small, honest things, she would remember the way the world had tried to name her and how she had chosen instead to speak. She would remember the dead sunflower and the velvet box and the cufflink all as markers in a map of hard-earned agency. She would remember Anthony's hands steady on a stretcher in the plant rubble and his voice saying, "We will do this with the police." She would remember forgiving without reconciling. She would remember saying yes with a full heart and a clear mind. They built a life that was neither perfect nor spectacular in the way tabloids define spectacle. There were tendernesses, a kitchen that often smelled of garlic and lemon, an office shelf with children's notes, an old book from which Anthony never refused a reading when the mood suggested small conspiracies. There were missteps and apologies. There were days of quiet routine and days when the shadow of what had been happened across the window. When the past bled into the present, they honored it, never letting it become an excuse for control. And Marcus? He learned his own lesson in the small currency of regret. He called once, 6 months later, not to ask for reconciliation, but to let her know he had finally moved apartments. He said awkwardly that he had been selfish. Emily listened, thanked him for the honesty, and then wished him well. It was a kindness that did not require him to be saved. The city moved on. Gossip gave birth to new headlines, but the tiny private life they had constructed weathered both the gale and the sun. Sometimes, on a slow evening, Emily would sit with a lesson plan in her lap and a cup of coffee at her side, and she would look at the ring that held the sunflower engraving and think about the way they had both chosen to stay small in their promises and large in their intentions. The last image of the story is not a tableau of victory over scandal, but a quiet domestic moment. Anthony washing dishes while humming an old tune his mother taught him. The rinse of water like a small, reliable drum. Emily laying out essays for a class she loved and placing a sunflower at the center of a small vase on the kitchen window. The house smelled of lemon and yeast and the small comfort of being seen. He will regret losing you, she remembered, and then she rewrote it in her mind. He will regret losing you if you ever choose wrong, but you will always have the right to choose differently. She had been left alone in a restaurant for 47 minutes, and in those minutes had learned what it meant to wait, to decide, and finally to accept someone who would not make her less. If you were moved by Emily and Anthony's story and want more long-form tales about love that demands honesty and courage, subscribe and stay for the next one.